Once upon a time, in the bustling city of Lagos, there lived a young woman named Amina. She was a radiant, intelligent woman of modest means, known for her unwavering spirit and her remarkable kindness. Amina worked as a school teacher in a small, rural community just outside the city. Despite the financial struggles she faced, she lived a peaceful life, proud of her independence and the future she was shaping for herself. Her humble roots were all she had ever known, but her dreams reached far beyond the small village she called home. It was during a medical outreach in her community that Amina first met Dr. Taio Alad. Dr. Taio was the son of one of the wealthiest families in Nigeria, a renowned billionaire doctor with a heart as big as his bank account. He had dedicated his life to healing others, traveling across Africa to provide free healthcare to those in need. The Alad family had built a medical empire, and Taio, the family's only son, was being groomed to take over. But Taio was different from his family. Despite his privileged upbringing, he believed in giving back and had a deep compassion for the poor. He often distanced himself from the high society circles that his family mingled with, preferring the fulfillment that came from helping those less fortunate. On that fateful day, Amina and Taio's paths crossed, and their connection was immediate. Amina had volunteered to assist at the outreach, her natural ability to comfort and care for others impressing Taio. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, genuine, humble, and warm-hearted. Taio admired her spirit, and over the weeks that followed, they grew closer. What began as friendship quickly blossomed into something deeper. They would meet in secret, away from the judgmental eyes of Taio's elite social circle. They talked for hours about their dreams, their fears, and their shared desire to make the world a better place. Their love grew strong, but it was not without its challenges. Amina, aware of the vast social divide between them, often questioned whether their relationship had a future. Taio, however, was adamant that nothing could come between them. He promised Amina that they would build a life together, despite what others thought. But as their love deepened, trouble loomed on the horizon. Unbeknownst to Taio, his mother, Mrs. Alad, had been keeping a close watch on his life. Mrs. Alad was a formidable woman, fiercely protective of the Alad family name and fortune. She was a woman of power and influence, accustomed to controlling every aspect of her son's life, and she had big plans for Taio, plans that did not include Amina. Mrs. Alad had heard whispers of Taio's relationship with the village girl, and she was not pleased. In her eyes, Amina was nothing more than an opportunist, a threat to the Alad legacy. She couldn't allow her son to tarnish their family's reputation by being involved with a woman of such low standing. Taio needed a wife who came from wealth and power, someone who could elevate their social standing even further, not a woman like Amina, who came from nothing. One day, Amina discovered she was pregnant. Filled with joy and fear, she knew she had to tell Taio. Their love had been secret, and now they were about to have a child together. Amina believed this would be the beginning of the future they had dreamed of. But before she could share the news, Mrs. Alad intervened. Amina was summoned to the Alad mansion under the guise of a private conversation. When she arrived, Mrs. Alad was waiting for her, her eyes cold and calculating. Without wasting any time, Mrs. Alad got straight to the point. "You are nothing to my son," Mrs. Alad said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Whatever you think you have with him, it ends today." Amina was stunned. She had never imagined that Taio's mother would speak to her so cruelly, but the worst was yet to come. Mrs. Alad had already learned about Amina's pregnancy. With a chilling calmness, she presented Amina with a proposition. Either she terminate the pregnancy and disappear from Taio's life forever, or Mrs. Alad would ruin her. She threatened to destroy Amina's family, tarnish her reputation in the village, and make sure that no one would ever dare to associate with her again. "I will make sure that you and your child never see the light of day," Mrs. Alade hissed, her voice cold and ruthless. "You don't belong in Taio's world, and I will not allow you to bring your bastard into it." Terrified, Amina felt trapped. She knew that Mrs. Alade had the power to carry out her threats. Taio's mother was not a woman to be crossed, and Amina could not risk the safety of her family or her unborn child. With a broken heart, she made the most painful decision of her life. She would leave Taio and raise their child alone. Without explanation, Amina vanished from Taio's life. She didn't tell him about the pregnancy, fearing what his mother might do if she disobeyed her orders. Taio, heartbroken and confused, was left to believe that Amina had simply abandoned him. To make matters worse, Taio's best friend, Dele, who had always been jealous of their relationship, fueled Taio's doubts by suggesting that Amina had left him for someone wealthier, someone better suited for her ambitions. Taio was devastated. He believed the woman he loved had chosen someone else, and the betrayal stung deeply. From that moment, he buried his pain under a facade of indifference, throwing himself into his work and building his medical empire. 5 years passed. Amina, now a single mother, was living in a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city. Her son, Cole, was her pride and joy. He was a bright, lively boy with his father's sharp mind and her gentle heart. Raising Cole on her own had not been easy, but Amina did everything she could to provide for him. She had no contact with Taio or his family, choosing to keep her distance to protect her son from the storm she knew could still come if Mrs. Alade discovered his existence. Life was difficult, but Amina had found solace in motherhood. However, her peaceful world was shattered when Cole suddenly fell ill. What began as fatigue and minor ailments quickly escalated into something far more serious. After a series of tests, doctors delivered devastating news. Cole had a rare genetic disorder, and his only chance of survival was a bone marrow transplant. The likelihood of finding a suitable donor was slim, but Amina knew there was one person who could be a match: Taio, Cole's father. Faced with no other options, Amina made the difficult decision to seek out Taio. She didn't know how he would react to seeing her after all these years, but she had no choice. Her son's life depended on it. When Amina walked into the sleek, glass-walled hospital owned by the Alade family, her heart pounded in her chest. Memories of her time with Taio flooded back as she approached the receptionist, requesting to see him. It wasn't long before Taio appeared, looking more distinguished than ever. His sharp features and confident stride reflected the years of success and growth that had passed since she last saw him. But the warmth that had once filled his eyes when he looked at her was gone. Instead, his gaze was cold, distant. "Taio," Amina began, her voice shaking slightly. "What are you doing here?" Taio interrupted, his tone harsh. "After all these years, you finally decide to show up?" Amina's heart sank. She had imagined this moment so many times, but she wasn't prepared for the bitterness in his voice. "I didn't come here to argue, Taio. It's about Cole, our son." Taio froze, the color draining from his face. "Our son?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Amina nodded, her eyes filled with tears. She explained everything: how she had discovered she was pregnant, how she had been forced to leave, and how Cole was now gravely ill. She begged Taio to help, to save their child's life. Taio listened in stunned silence, his emotions a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. For 5 years, he had believed that Amina had left him for his best friend, Dele, that she had chosen a life without him, and now She was telling him that she had been pregnant with his child all along. "You hid my son from me for 5 years," Taio said through gritted teeth. "Why?" Amina hesitated, knowing that revealing the full truth would open wounds that could never heal. "I was protecting him," she said softly. "Your mother—" "Don't blame my mother for your choices," Taio snapped, his voice rising. "You left Amina. You didn't even give me a chance." The tension between them was palpable, but despite his anger, Taio couldn't ignore the fact that Cole was his son. He agreed to perform the tests to determine if he was a match for the bone marrow transplant. But the air between him and Amina remained thick with unresolved pain and unanswered questions. As the tests were conducted, Taio struggled with his emotions. He had never stopped loving Amina, but the bitterness he had carried in his heart for years clouded his judgment. He wanted to help Cole, but he couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. Days passed, and the test results confirmed what Amina had feared and hoped for. Taio was a perfect match for Cole. Taio's emotions were conflicted. He was relieved that he could help save his son's life, but the betrayal he felt toward Amina lingered. He couldn't understand why she had kept Cole a secret for so long, why she hadn't trusted him to protect them both. On the day of the surgery, the hospital was tense. Amina stood outside the operating room, her heart pounding, as she watched Taio prepare to perform the transplant. He was both a father and a doctor in that moment, and his dual role weighed heavily on him. Despite his personal feelings toward Amina, Taio's love for Cole had already taken root. He knew that this was his responsibility, not only as a doctor, but as a father. As the surgery proceeded, Amina's mind raced with memories of their time together. She remembered the way Taio had once looked at her with so much love and warmth, the dreams they had shared of a future together. Those dreams had been shattered by fear and manipulation, but she still loved him deeply. Even after all these years, she knew that Taio had every right to be angry, but she also knew that she had acted out of a need to protect her child from his ruthless mother. When the surgery was finally over, the doctor emerged to let Amina know that everything had gone smoothly. Cole was stable, and Taio had done his job flawlessly. Amina's heart swelled with relief, but she knew that the real challenge was yet to come. There were still so many unspoken words between her and Taio, so many truths that had yet to be revealed. Taio emerged from the operating room a few minutes later, his face drawn with exhaustion. His eyes met Amina's, and for a moment, they simply stood in silence. The weight of everything that had happened between them hung in the air. "He's going to be okay," Taio said quietly, breaking the silence. "Our son will live." Amina nodded, her eyes filling with tears of gratitude. "Thank you, Taio. I'll never be able to repay you for what you've done." Taio sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not about repayment, Amina. He's my son, too. I would have done anything for him if I had known." Amina swallowed hard, knowing that this was the moment she had been dreading. She had to tell Taio the full truth about why she had left, why she had kept Cole a secret. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "Taio, I didn't leave because I wanted to," she said softly. "I left because I had no choice. Your mother, she threatened me." Taio's eyes darkened at the mention of his mother. "What do you mean? What did she do?" Amina explained everything. How Mrs. Alad had found out about her pregnancy, how she had threatened to ruin her family and destroy her life if she didn't leave Taio and terminate the pregnancy. She told him how terrified she had been, how she had believed that leaving was the only way to protect Cole from his mother's wrath. "I was scared, Taio," Amina said, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to leave you, but your mother made it clear that she would do anything to keep us apart. I thought that if I stayed, she would hurt Cole. or worse. Taio stood there, stunned. His heart ached as he listened to Amina's story, the truth finally dawning on him. For years, he had believed that Amina had left him because she didn't love him, that she had chosen someone else over him. But now, he realized that she had been forced to make an impossible choice. "My mother did this?" Taio asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "She threatened you and our son." Amina nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't know what else to do. I thought I was protecting Cole by leaving. I'm so sorry, Taio. I never wanted to hurt you." Taio clenched his fists, anger boiling inside him. His own mother had destroyed the love of his life and kept him from knowing his son. He felt a surge of betrayal, unlike anything he had ever experienced. But as he looked into Amina's tear-filled eyes, he knew that she had suffered just as much as he had. "I should have known," Taio whispered, his voice filled with regret. "I should have fought harder for us. I should have trusted you." Amina shook her head, stepping closer to him. "You couldn't have known, Taio. She kept us apart, and I let her. But we're here now, and we have a chance to make things right. For Cole." Taio's anger slowly gave way to a deep sense of sadness and guilt. He had spent years resenting Amina, believing that she had abandoned him, when in reality, she had sacrificed everything to protect their child. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm yet gentle. "We've lost so much time," Taio said softly. "But I don't want to lose any more. I love you, Amina. I always have. I never stopped." Amina's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had dreamed of hearing those words again for so long, but she had never believed it would happen. She squeezed his hand, tears still falling down her cheeks. "I love you too, Taio," she whispered. "I never stopped loving you." They stood there, holding each other's hands, their hearts finally beginning to heal after years of pain and separation. But even as they embraced the possibility of a future together, both of them knew that their reunion wouldn't be without challenges. Days after the transplant, Cole's health began to improve. He was still weak, but the doctors were optimistic about his recovery. Amina and Taio spent every moment they could by his side, watching over their son as he slowly regained his strength. However, their fragile peace was soon threatened when Mrs. Alade learned that Amina and Cole were back in Taio's life. She had always been a woman who wielded power like a weapon, and she wasn't about to let go of control so easily. The news of Cole's existence enraged her, and she vowed to do whatever it took to drive Amina out of Taio's life, once and for all. One evening, as Amina and Taio sat by Cole's hospital bed, the door to the room swung open. Mrs. Alade stood in the doorway, her face a mask of cold fury. "Taio," she said sharply, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Amina. "What is she doing here, and who is that child?" Taio stood up, his expression hardening. "Mother, this is Cole. He's my son." Mrs. Alade's eyes widened in shock, but her expression quickly turned to anger. "Your son? How could you let this woman back into your life after everything she's done?" "She hasn't done anything," Taio replied firmly. "You're the one who kept us apart. You threatened her, forced her to leave, and kept me from knowing my own son." Mrs. Alade's face turned pale, but she quickly recovered, her voice cold and cutting. "I did what I had to do to protect you from making a mistake. She's beneath you, Taio. She doesn't belong in our family." Taio stepped closer to his mother, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "I love Amina. I loved her then, and I love her now. And Cole is my son. You don't get to decide who I have in my life anymore." Mrs. Alade's lips thinned, but she could see that Taio was resolute. The power she had wielded over him for so long was slipping away, and she knew it. But she wasn't ready to admit defeat. "You're making a mistake, Taio," she said coldly. "She'll ruin everything." "No, Mother," Taio replied. "The only mistake was letting you control my life for so long. I'm not going to lose Amina and Cole again." Mrs. Alade stared at him for a long moment, her eyes flashing with anger. But there was nothing more she could do. Without another word, she turned and left the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. As the door closed behind her, Taio let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned to Amina, who had been silently watching the confrontation unfold. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Amina nodded, stepping forward to take his hand. "I am now." In the weeks that followed, Cole's health continued to improve, and Amina and Taio began to rebuild their relationship. There were still wounds to heal and obstacles to overcome, but they were determined to face them together. Taio worked to mend the broken trust between them, and Amina slowly let go of the fears that had haunted her for so long. As a family, they began to forge a new path, one filled with love, hope, and the promise of a future they had once thought was lost forever. But even as they moved forward, there was still a shadow lurking in the background. Mrs. Alade. Though she had been forced to step aside, her presence remained a constant reminder that the peace they had found could be fragile. And while she had lost this battle, Amina and Taio knew that she would not give up easily. Yet, despite the challenges ahead, they were ready. Together, they had found their way back to each other, their love stronger and more resilient than ever before. The hardships they had endured only solidified the bond they shared, a bond forged in pain, sacrifice, and enduring love. Though the path ahead was uncertain and Mrs. Alade's presence still loomed like a dark cloud, Amina and Taio had made a silent promise to never let anyone come between them again. As they settled into their new life as a family, Amina found herself once again filled with hope. For so long, she had carried the burden of her secret, raising Cole in fear and isolation. Now, seeing Taio with their son, watching him be the father Cole had always deserved, filled her heart with joy. She could finally exhale, free from the chains of the past. Taio, too, felt the transformation in his life. Where there had once been bitterness and anger, there was now forgiveness and understanding. He realized that the years he had spent resenting Amina had been wasted, fueled by lies and misunderstandings. Now that the truth had come to light, he was determined to make up for the lost time, to be the man and father he should have been from the start. Cole, blissfully unaware of the complex emotions swirling around him, began to thrive. With both of his parents now by his side, his health improved daily, and his playful laughter once again filled the house. He was the living embodiment of the love that had once been hidden but could no longer be denied. His resilience in the face of his illness inspired both Taio and Amina, serving as a reminder of what truly mattered: family. Still, there were lingering issues to resolve, particularly with Mrs. Alade. Despite her attempts to keep them apart, she was now a grandmother to Cole, and Taio struggled with how to manage his relationship with his mother. He could not simply cut her out of his life, but he also refused to allow her to dictate his future. Taio knew he would eventually have to confront his mother and set firm boundaries. The power she had once held over him was gone, and he was prepared to face whatever consequences that brought. One day, as Taio sat alone in his office, his mother arrived unannounced, her expression as cold and unreadable as ever. She entered without knocking, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. "Taio," Mrs. Alade began, her voice firm, "we need to talk." Taio looked up from his desk, his eyes meeting hers without hesitation. He no longer felt the intimidation that had once colored their relationship. He was ready for this conversation, ready to stand his ground. "I thought we already had this conversation," Taio replied coolly, leaning back in his chair. Mrs. Alad's lips tightened. "You don't understand what you're getting into with her," she said, her voice low and edged with warning. "She's not one of us. She will drag you down. And that boy, Taio interrupted, his voice sharp, is your grandson. And Amina is the woman I love, the mother of my child. You need to accept that, or walk away." The finality in his words stunned Mrs. Alade. She had never seen her son defy her so openly, and it shook her deeply. For years she had controlled every aspect of Taio's life, believing that she knew what was best for him. But now, standing before him, she saw that her influence had crumbled. She had lost him, not to Amina, but to her own misguided need for control. Mrs. Alad's face softened, and for the first time in a long while, she looked vulnerable. "I only wanted what was best for you," she said quietly. "I didn't want to see you make a mistake." Taio shook his head, rising to his feet and walking over to her. "Mother, you've always tried to control my life, but this isn't about you anymore. It's about me, Amina, and Cole. We're a family now, and I won't let you come between us again." There was a long silence as Mrs. Alade absorbed his words. She glanced down at her hands, the weight of her actions settling on her shoulders. She had lost the battle she had fought so hard to win, and now, standing before her son, she realized that continuing to fight would only push him further away. Finally, she nodded, her eyes filled with reluctant acceptance. "I see that now," she whispered. "I see that you've made your choice." Taio watched her closely, waiting for the storm that never came. Instead, his mother seemed smaller, diminished by the weight of her own pride and stubbornness. She turned to leave, pausing at the door. "I just hope," she said softly, "that she's worth it." Without another word, Mrs. Alade walked out, her departure less triumphant than she had imagined. But for Taio, it wasn't a victory. It was simply an end to a long, painful chapter in his life. In the weeks that followed, Amina, Taio, and Cole settled into their new normal. Their life was far from perfect. There were still challenges ahead, still moments of doubt and fear. But they faced those challenges together, as a family. Amina returned to her work, though now with more balance, knowing she had Taio by her side to share the responsibilities of raising Cole. Taio, for his part, continued to run his hospital with the same dedication and compassion he always had, but now with a newfound sense of purpose. His family was his anchor, the reason he had fought so hard, and the reason he would continue to fight. They rebuilt their relationship slowly, healing old wounds and creating new memories. There were difficult conversations, moments of anger and sadness, but they always found their way back to each other. The love they had shared years ago had never truly died. It had simply been buried beneath layers of fear, manipulation, and misunderstanding. Now, it was free to grow again, stronger than ever before. As the months passed, Cole's health continued to improve. He was soon well enough to return to school, his energy and playful nature returning in full force. Watching him thrive brought joy to both Amina and Taio's hearts, a reminder of how far they had come. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, casting a warm glow over their home, Amina and Taio sat on the porch, watching Cole play in the yard. The sound of his laughter filled the air, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they both felt a deep sense of peace. Amina leaned her head against Taio's shoulder, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "Do you think we'll ever truly be free of the past?" she asked quietly. Taio wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. The past is a part of us, Amina, he replied gently, but it doesn't define us. What matters is the life we're building now, together. Amina smiled, her heart swelling with love for the man who had once been her greatest source of pain and was now her greatest source of strength. Together, they had faced their darkest moments, and together, they had found their way back to the light. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, they knew one thing for certain. This time, they would face them as a family. Because love, no matter how long it had been buried, had finally triumphed. And nothing, not even the weight of the past, could tear them apart again. The end. Did you enjoy this story? Kindly let me know in the comments section, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe for more interesting African folk tales. Bye, bestie. See you on my next Folktales.